Summer of 1941. The world held its breath. On June 22nd, Adolf Hitler unleashed Operation Barbarossa, the largest land invasion in human history. Over 3 million German soldiers, thousands of tanks and waves of aircraft smashed across the border into the Soviet Union. This was a new kind of war, a blitzkrieg designed for lightning-fast victory. The initial shock was devastating. The German war machine seemed unstoppable, a relentless tide of steel and fire that rolled eastward across the vast plains of Ukraine and Belarus. The Soviet Red Army, caught off guard and suffering from recent purges of its officer corps, was in a state of chaos and disarray. The front lines were not clear, defined lines on a map. Instead, they were a fluid, terrifying mess of advances and retreats. Communications were severed. Entire divisions were encircled and annihilated before they even knew what was happening. For the individual Soviet soldier, it was an experience of profound confusion and terror. They were facing an enemy that was better equipped, better trained, and riding a wave of seemingly invincible momentum. The scale of the German advance was simply staggering, swallowing up territory faster than anyone could comprehend. It was a time of desperation, where survival itself was a victory, and the future of the Soviet Union hung by a thread. In this maelstrom of destruction, the logistics of war became a nightmare. Supply lines, the very arteries that keep an army alive, were stretched to their breaking point and constantly under threat. Every road, every bridge, every forest path could hide an enemy ambush. Getting ammunition, food and medical supplies to the front was a task of immense danger. The men tasked with these duties were often not frontline combat troops. They were drivers, cooks and quartermasters, the unsung heroes whose work was just as vital and, in this chaotic environment, just as deadly as that of the infantryman in his trench. This was the world that Dmitry Romanovich Ovcharenko, a young private in the Red Army, found himself in. The grand strategies of generals in Moscow meant little on the ground. For him, the war was a daily struggle for survival amidst the dust, heat, and constant threat of sudden violent death. He was a tiny cog in a vast, grinding machine that was being pushed back relentlessly. The air was thick with the smell of cordite and the sounds of distant artillery. Every shadow could conceal a German patrol. It was a brutal and unforgiving environment, one that would test the courage of even the most hardened soldiers to their absolute limit. Dmitry Ovcharenko was not born a warrior. He was born in 1919 in the small village of Ovcharovo in the Luhansk region of Ukraine. His was a life tied to the earth. He came from a family of poor peasants, and his world was one of hard physical labour from a very young age. He was a carpenter by trade, a man who understood the feel of wood and the heft of an axe. His hands were calloused and strong, not from military drills, but from felling trees and building homes. He was a quiet, unassuming young man, described by those who knew him as simple and straightforward. His education was basic, his ambitions modest. He was, in every sense, an ordinary man. His early life was shaped by the rhythms of the seasons and the demands of the farm. He knew the hardship of rural life, the constant toil required to put food on the table. This background, however, had forged in him a powerful physical constitution and a deep well of resilience. He was strong, not in the sculpted way of an athlete, but in the practical, enduring way of a man who has worked with his hands his entire life. He was no stranger to fatigue or adversity. This physical toughness and familiarity with manual tools would, in a way that no one could have ever predicted, become his greatest assets in the crucible of war. When the war broke out, Dmitry, like millions of other young Soviet men, was conscripted into the Red Army. He was not placed in an elite guards unit or a tank crew. He was assigned to the 389th Rifle Division, but his specific role was far from the front lines of combat. He became a supply cart driver, a yedzavoy. His job was to guide a horse-drawn cart, a simple wooden wagon, carrying essential supplies like ammunition and food to the fighting companies. It was a humble, unglamorous role, often looked down upon by the combat infantrymen. He was, in the military hierarchy, just a delivery boy. His primary weapon was not even his rifle, which he carried more as a formality. His most familiar and trusted tool remained a simple wood-handled axe that he kept on his cart. It was there for practical purposes, to chop firewood for cooking, to clear fallen trees from the path, or to make repairs to his wagon. It was a tool of his former life, a remnant of his peaceful peasant past. No one, least of all Dmitry himself, could have imagined that this ordinary carpenter's axe would soon become an instrument of shocking violence and a symbol of incredible, desperate courage against overwhelming odds. On the scorching hot day of July 13th, 1941, near the small town of Pestets in southern Ukraine, Private Ovcharenko was given a routine assignment. His company, part of the 176th Rifle Regiment, was dug in and desperately needed resupply. Their ammunition was running low and the men were hungry. Dmitry's task was simple: load his horse-drawn cart with 50-kilogram crates of ammunition and several sacks of food, and make the perilous journey of a few kilometers to their forward positions. The landscape was a patchwork of open fields and small wooded areas, offering both concealment and the constant threat of ambush. Every rustle of leaves, every shadow, could be a German patrol. He set off alone, the only sounds being the creak of the wooden cart's wheels and the steady plodding of his horse. The air was heavy with the tension of the front. The distant, sporadic crackle of machine gun fire was a constant reminder of the danger that lay all around him. This was a lonely and nerve-wracking job. He was a single, slow-moving target in a landscape controlled by a fast-advancing enemy. But orders were orders, and the men at the front were depending on him. He urged his horse on, his eyes scanning the tree lines, his senses on high alert for any sign of trouble. Suddenly, his journey came to an abrupt and terrifying halt. As he rounded a bend in the path, he found himself face to face with the enemy. It was not just one or two soldiers, but a large German reconnaissance patrol. A staff car had stopped, and alongside it were two trucks filled with soldiers. In total, about 50 German infantrymen and 3 officers were right in front of him. They spotted him at the same moment he saw them. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. His slow-moving cart was no match for their motorized vehicles. In an instant, his simple supply run had turned into a life-or-death situation. The German soldiers swarmed around him, their rifles levelled. They were confident, professional, and clearly in control. They barked orders in a language he didn't understand. With rifles pointed at his chest, he was roughly disarmed. One of the soldiers snatched his Mosin Nagant rifle from his shoulder before he could even think of using it. He was pushed and prodded towards the German staff car, where the officers began an interrogation. They saw a lone, poorly dressed Soviet soldier with a horse and cart. To them, he was a pitiful, non-threatening figure, a piece of battlefield debris to be dealt with quickly. The German officers who surrounded Dmitry Ovcharenko looked at him not as a soldier, but as a curiosity. Here was a single dishevelled man, seemingly lost and alone. They saw his simple peasant's face, his worn uniform, and his primitive horse-drawn cart. In their eyes, he was the perfect embodiment of the subhuman Slavic enemy their propaganda had described. They were soldiers of the mighty Wehrmacht, the conquerors of Europe, equipped with the finest weapons and machinery. He was a relic from another century. Their confidence, bordering on arrogance, was palpable. They had just disarmed him without a struggle, and now he stood before them, helpless. The interrogation began. The senior German officer, likely wanting information about Soviet troop positions, started shouting questions at Dmitry. They gestured, trying to get him to reveal the location of his unit. But Ovcharenko stood there, playing the part of a terrified, simple-minded peasant. He likely appeared confused and utterly broken by fear. This act, whether intentional or a genuine reaction to his capture, only reinforced the Germans' perception of him. They saw no threat, no fight in his eyes. He was just another captive, and a particularly unimpressive one at that. Their guard was completely down. This overconfidence led them to make a critical and ultimately fatal mistake. Having taken his rifle, they considered him completely neutralized. They turned their attention away from him, with some soldiers laughing and joking, others beginning to inspect the contents of his cart. The officers continued their discussion, dismissing the lone prisoner as a trivial matter. They failed to notice the one tool he still had within reach. Lying amongst the sacks and crates on his wagon was his trusty axe. It was an object so mundane, so non-military, that they paid it no mind. To them it was just a piece of farm equipment, not a weapon. This moment of contempt and inattention created a tiny window of opportunity. The Germans saw a defeated man. What they failed to see was the raw, desperate strength forged by a lifetime of hard labour. They underestimated the primal instinct for survival that burned within this quiet cart driver. They had taken his rifle, but they had left him with the tool he knew best. Their arrogance had blinded them to the danger that was standing right in front of them. They believed the fight was over before it had even begun, a miscalculation that would cost them dearly in the seconds that followed. As the German officer stood close to the cart, shouting and gesturing, something inside Dmitry Ovcharenko snapped. The fear and confusion were replaced by a cold, sudden surge of adrenaline. He saw his chance. With a speed that utterly defied his simple appearance, he reached into his cart, and his hand closed around the familiar wooden handle of his axe. In one fluid, powerful motion, he swung it. The heavy blade sliced through the air and struck the interrogating officer in the neck. The officer collapsed instantly, his interrogation ending in a spray of blood. The sudden, shocking brutality of the act stunned the nearby Germans for a priceless second. Before they could react, Ovcharenko was a whirlwind of motion. He was not a soldier executing a trained maneuver. He was a man possessed by a desperate will to live. He grabbed 3 grenades from his cart, which the Germans had inexplicably overlooked. He hurled them one after another into the tightly packed group of soldiers standing near the trucks. The explosions were devastating. The air was filled with smoke, shrapnel, and the screams of the wounded and dying. In a few seconds, the scene of calm superiority had transformed into a chaotic slaughterhouse. 21 German soldiers were killed instantly by the grenade blasts. The surviving Germans, gripped by panic and confusion, scattered. They couldn't comprehend what was happening. A moment ago, they had a helpless prisoner. Now they were being attacked with savage efficiency. Ovcharenko wasn't finished. As a second officer who had been wounded by the grenades tried to flee, Dmitri chased him down. With the grim determination of a predator, he caught up to the man in a nearby vegetable garden, and with another swing of his axe, killed him as well. The fury of his attack was as brief as it was total. The entire engagement, from the first axe blow to the death of the second officer, had lasted less than a minute. A third officer, seeing the unbelievable carnage, managed to escape along with the remaining soldiers. They fled in terror, leaving behind their dead, their weapons, and their vehicles. A lone, axe-wielding cart driver had just single-handedly routed a platoon of 50 battle-hardened German soldiers. He stood for a moment, breathing heavily, amidst the smoke and the bodies. He was still just a simple peasant from Ovcharovo, but in those 45 seconds of primal fury, he had become an unlikely and honestly terrifying hero of the Red Army. He had turned his fear into a weapon and his simple tool into an instrument of legend. Dmitri Ovcharenko did not linger on the scene of the slaughter. His training, however basic, and his sense of duty took over. He was still a soldier with a mission to complete. Ignoring the grisly scene around him, he quickly gathered what he could. He collected maps from the dead officers, important documents from the staff car, and a number of captured German MP-40 submachine guns and ammunition. These were valuable intelligence and superior weapons that his own unit desperately needed. He loaded these spoils of his improbable victory onto his cart alongside the original supplies he was meant to deliver. He then calmly guided his horse and cart back onto the path and continued his journey. When he finally arrived at his company's position, his comrades were astonished. They had been waiting anxiously for the ammunition, fearing the cart had been lost. Instead, Ovcharenko rolled in not only with the needed supplies, but also with a haul of enemy weapons and blood-soaked German maps. He calmly reported to his company commander, Political Commissar Jarov, and explained what had happened. He recounted the ambush, the interrogation, and his furious, desperate counterattack. At first, his story was met with disbelief. It sounded like a tall tale, the fantastical invention of a shell-shocked soldier. How could one man, armed only with an axe and a few grenades, possibly defeat 50 German soldiers, killing over 20 of them? But the evidence was undeniable. The captured weapons, the pristine officer maps, the documents, and the bloodstains on Ovcharenko and his cart told the truth. The commissar and the company commander realized they were in the presence of a man who had accomplished something truly extraordinary. The news spread like wildfire through the weary and beleaguered unit. The impact on morale was immediate and immense. At a time of constant retreat and defeat, here was a story of incredible defiant victory. It showed that the seemingly invincible German soldier was not a superman. He could bleed, he could die, and he could be beaten, even by a single, determined man. Ovcharenko was no longer just a humble cart driver. He was a hero. His commander immediately wrote up a report and recommended him for the Soviet Union's highest honor. The story of his feat provided a much-needed injection of hope and fighting spirit into the hearts of his fellow soldiers. Dmitri Ovcharenko's incredible act of defiance was not the end of his military career. It was the beginning. His bravery was officially recognized on November 9th, 1941. In a formal ceremony, he was awarded the title of Hero of the Soviet Union and the Order of Lenin, the nation's highest military and civilian decorations. The farm boy from Ovcharovo, the quiet cart driver, was now officially a national hero. He was transferred from his supply role into a frontline machine gun platoon where his courage could be put to more direct use. His rifle, once taken from him by the Germans, was replaced by a formidable DP-27 light machine gun. He continued to fight with the same tenacity he'd shown on that fateful July day. He participated in numerous battles as the Red Army clawed its way back from the brink of defeat. The war on the Eastern Front was a brutal, grinding affair, and Ovcharenko was in the thick of it. He was wounded twice in combat, a testament to the ferocity of the fighting he endured. Yet each time he recovered and returned to the front lines. He fought through the defensive battles of 1942, the turning point at Stalingrad, and the great offensive pushes that eventually drove the German army back towards Berlin. His story became a piece of inspirational propaganda for the Soviet war effort. Newspapers and radio broadcasts told the tale of the axe-wielding hero, a symbol of the unbreakable spirit of the common Soviet citizen. He represented the idea that every person, no matter their background, could contribute to the great patriotic war. His feat was a powerful message. Do not underestimate the quiet, ordinary people of the land. His legend grew, providing a human face to the vast, anonymous struggle being waged across a continent. He was proof that individual courage could make a difference, even against the most overwhelming odds. Unlike so many millions of his comrades, Dmitry Ovcharenko survived the war. He saw the final victory in 1945, having fought from the dark days of retreat to the final triumph in Berlin. He had started the war as a simple cart driver and ended it as a decorated combat veteran and a celebrated hero of his nation. His journey was a microcosm of the Soviet experience itself, from the edge of annihilation to ultimate victory, fueled by incredible sacrifice, resilience, and moments of astonishing, unexpected bravery. He had faced the worst of humanity and had not only survived, but had prevailed. After the guns fell silent in 1945, Dmitry Ovcharenko, like millions of other soldiers, was demobilized and returned to civilian life. He left the world of combat, medals, and military parades behind him. He did not seek a high-profile position or try to capitalize on his fame. Instead, he simply went home. He returned to the life he had known before the war, the life of a working man. He settled in the city of Svatov, not far from his home village in the Luhansk region of Ukraine. The celebrated axe-wielding hero put down his machine gun and picked up his old tools. He found work first as the head of a local district department and later returned to his roots, working at a collective farm. There was a quiet dignity in this choice. After experiencing the horrors and accolades of war, he found peace in the familiar rhythms of civilian labor. He married and started a family, raising a daughter. He was known in his community not as a fearsome warrior, but as a quiet, hard-working and modest man. He rarely spoke of his wartime exploits. The 45 seconds of savage violence that had defined his life in the eyes of the state were a memory he kept largely to himself. His life, however, was tragically cut short. The war had left invisible scars on many of its survivors, but for Dmitry, the end came not from a lingering wound or psychological trauma, but from a simple accident. In 1985, decades after the war had ended, he passed away. The details are sparse, but his death was as unadorned as his life had been. He was buried in his hometown, a local hero who had once been a national icon. He lived his post-war years not as a legend, but as a father, a husband, and a worker, finding contentment in the ordinary world he had fought so desperately to save. His passing marked the end of a remarkable life. He had been thrust onto the stage of history by a chance encounter and had responded with an act of almost unbelievable ferocity and courage. Then, just as quickly, he had receded back into the quiet life of an ordinary citizen. His story is a powerful reminder that the heroes of war are most often ordinary people who are forced by extraordinary circumstances to do extraordinary things. His peaceful post-war life is as much a part of his legacy as his wartime feat, a testament to the enduring human desire for normalcy and peace. The story of Dmitry Ovcharenko is more than just a dramatic tale from the blood-soaked Eastern Front. It is a profound lesson in courage, perception, and the nature of heroism. His legacy is not just about the 21 enemy soldiers he killed, but about the circumstances that led to that moment. It is a stark reminder to never judge a person by their appearance or station. The German officers saw a simple, harmless peasant. They failed to see the strength in his hands, the resilience in his heart, and the desperate will to live that lay dormant within him. Their arrogance was their undoing. His story teaches us that heroes are not born. They are made in moments of crisis. Ovcharenko was not a trained special forces operator, he was a supply clerk. His weapon was not a state-of-the-art rifle, but a common carpenter's axe. This is the core of his legend. That bravery is not the exclusive property of generals or elite soldiers. It can be found in the most unexpected people, in the most humble of roles. His actions demonstrate that courage is often a reaction, a primal refusal to surrender in the face of certain death. It is the decision to fight back, with whatever tools you have, when all hope seems lost. Furthermore, Ovcharenko's feat had a tangible impact beyond his own survival. In the summer of 1941, the Red Army was starved for good news. Stories of defeat and retreat were everywhere. His single-handed victory, once verified and shared, became a beacon of hope. It was a powerful piece of propaganda, yes, but it was also a true story that told every Soviet soldier and citizen that the enemy was not invincible. It showed that one person's actions could indeed change the course of their own small part of the war, providing a massive boost to morale when it was needed most. Ultimately, the legacy of the axe-wielding hero is a timeless testament to the human spirit. It reminds us that history is not only shaped by grand armies and famous leaders, but also by the individual acts of ordinary people. Dmitry Ovcharenko's 45 seconds of fury on a dusty Ukrainian road in 1941 echo through time as a powerful example of how one person, armed with little more than courage and a simple tool, can stand against overwhelming force and triumph. His story is a powerful affirmation that even in the darkest of times, the potential for greatness resides within us all.